Convenience makes things easy, without regard to whether easiness is truly what's most valuable in any given context. Take those services, on which I've relied too much in recent years, that let you design and then remotely mail a birthday card, so you never see or touch the physical item yourself. Better than nothing, perhaps. But sender and recipient both know it's a poor substitute for purchasing a card in a shop, writing on it by hand, and then walking to a mailbox to mail it. Because contrary to the cliche, it really isn't the thought that counts, but the effort, which is to say, the inconvenience. Welcome to Think on These Books. Today's book is 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. If this is your first time listening, which I know it is because this is the episode number 1, expect to hear not a summary or Spark Notes version of the book, but an extension of the ideas presented. My goal in this show is and always will be to inspire you to read the book for yourself, to use this episode to enrich the reading experience rather than spoil it. And for the time being, as I'm doing, philosophy, self-help, it's not too difficult to avoid spoiling a book like that. But in the future, there will be a few episodes of fiction. And just keep in mind, I'll always kind of mention that there are spoilers if you consider that a self-help book or a philosophy book can have spoilers. And because of that, this is a pretty comprehensive episode. Know that whether or not you've read the book before, this podcast will be usable to you. You will be able to understand what I'm talking about. I'll give context to every little blurb that I might mention from the book. To start, I want to talk about the cover of this book, which is not something that's always worth talking about. But I think this is the rare exception for myself where the reason I got this book, the reason I bought it on Amazon was not because I heard a recommendation, because that's where most of my books come from, is hearing recommendations on podcasts and interviews. But no, this was an impulse buy. And really, it was the cover that drew me to it. And so for the people who are audio only, you can either quickly look up a picture of this cover or just listen to me describe it. But really, I think just from the words alone, the subtitle, Time Management for Mortals, I think if I had to distill why I bought this book, that's why. The phrase, for mortals, that's really what caught my attention in the first place. Of course, the cover, the title, the subtitle, it all perfectly encapsulates the book, but I didn't know that at the time. All I knew was that this was a book for mortals. Not another self-help book for you, for your badass self, for rebels, for wanting to be the top 1%, for wanting to be a millionaire. It was just for mortals. Now, mortals makes me think of Greek gods, of the Percy Jackson series I read back in grade school, of Roman emperors, of Marcus Aurelius and his book Meditations. Essentially, it took me back to an ancient time. And like I said, that does get foreshadowed. That is kind of mentioned throughout the book, but it's really not the entirety of the book. It's not just a, Ryan Holiday-esque stoicism brought to the modern audience. But it is still something that drew me to it. And that's further solidified this image of this is something about, ancients of Greek and Roman philosophy. That was solidified by a little image of a Greek titan named Atlas. In the corner of the cover, not holding up the world, but holding up a clock. But all that's juxtaposed and brought back to modernity with a subtitle that's highlighted. And that iconic bright yellow that you associate with studying for tests, of being productive in the most generic sense of the word. Highlighter yellow. I love that combination of, all these ancient elements in the subtitle and that little icon with the highlighter yellow. And I bring all this up, the reason I'm spending a few minutes on the cover itself is because I want to express an important opinion about the book before we actually talk about what's inside. In my opinion, this book is a philosophy book disguised or masked as a self-help book. Again, I usually don't give a crap about what genre a book is, but it's really interesting that it is considered self-help and philosophy. And I'll discuss why I think that matters a little bit later in the episode, but for now, just keep in mind that this book is designed for reflection, not practical advice, step-by-step instructions to be, more efficient with your time like a lot of other time management books are. And even if some of those tips and tidbits are sprinkled in to appease the genre, just know that I think this book is truly a philosophical book. Instead of going in the order that this book is presented in, instead of going chapter by chapter, I'm breaking this episode into 3, maybe 4 parts if you count the conclusion, but breaking it by looking at all the anecdotes that really stood out to me and categorizing them. And if I had to name those 3 kind of overarching themes of the anecdotes, there was 1, the evolution of clock time, 2, productivity existentialism, and 3, secular and scientific solutions. And then that 4th one will be my concluding thoughts. I know I'm doing a lot of build-up before I actually start discussing the ideas, but to give you an overarching idea of what this book is about, if I had to sum it up in a sentence or 2, the intention of the book, I would say it's something like,
time to wake up, okay? Hello, can you hear me? Wake up, Chrissy! Chrissy, wake up! I don't like this, Chrissy, wake up!
And maybe his language is a little less colorful than that, but the sentiment is there. Wake up. Productivity is a trap. And that brings us to theme category number 1, the evolution of clock time. At the start of this book, the author introduces you to the timelessness of the Middle Ages, or rather a lack of clock time, and therefore a lack of time problems. A time problem being having too much to do in too little time, or too little to do in too much time. With all the obvious problems a peasant may face in medieval England, there was not the problem of time. In fact, time was a non-thing. Unquantified, just as we don't count every breath we take today, time was ineffable. There were no standardized hours, is what the author points out. But just as a little side note, I think the author was a little bit simplistic on this point because, sundials have been around since the time of ancient Egyptians. But I think his point is that for all those measurement tools of the past, there was no dollars per hour mindset that had been ingrained in us since really the rise of industrialism. But that thought-provoking point that he makes right at the start of the book is that today, with standardized 24-hour clocks being so ingrained in every culture, essentially, we've forgotten that clock time is a conceptual invention. Just like the concept of democracy, just like the concept of money. And when clock time is so deeply entrenched in how you see the world, we tend to think about time as something measurable, capturable, and savable. Instead of time being something fluid as the air we breathe and move through, with this conceptual idea of clock time, we begin to subconsciously view time and hours and days as blocks. Blocks that you may think of as steadily moving across a conveyor belt. And that credit belongs to Edward Hall, who came up with that metaphor. Now, I've heard this idea before, almost exclusively in spiritual books, the idea being that clock time is sort of this man-made myth. The Power of Now mentions that, Untethered Soul, some of Alan Watts' books, but I think the author encapsulates the secular version of this idea that makes it more accessible to the practical American, who doesn't have time for the woo-woo, foo-foo, spiritual hippie crap. The idea is the same, though. Standardized clock time is new in the grand scheme of humanity. It's not a given, it's not a default, it's something invented. And why is that important? I mean, what could a modern, civilized human possibly learn from a peasant in the Middle Ages? To put it simply, the peasant does not make his tasks fit into blocks of time. The idea would almost sound absurd to him. You want me to milk the cow when the sun is there, then finish when the sun is there? He'd think you're a lunatic. We, the modern folk, use conceptual abstract time as our foundation and then fill our schedule with tasks. The clear absurdity is that in this method of filling our time, is that if we do have that blank space in our schedule, then we tend to view it negatively or feverishly attempt to justify its purpose. This hour of me not doing anything, that's my relaxation time. I just need 30 minutes of downtime, then I'll be back to my good old productive self. And yet, from the modern perspective of things, the point of scheduling tasks, of optimizing our schedule, of being uber productive is to, drumroll please, have enough free time, that famed but feared thing, which holds the possibilities of everything we've ever wanted to do in our lives and then some. Of course, this is an illusion. Of course, this is absurd, but it's not always easy to see that. And to double down on that point, there's a parable which maybe you've heard before. I'll quickly summarize it as best as I can, called the Mexican Fisherman story. There's a Mexican fisherman who spent his mornings fishing. He'd get home, cook the fish, and if he had a little extra, then he'd sell it on the market. He'd take naps in the afternoon, then have a few cervezas and play cards with his friends at night. One day, a businessman on vacation sees the fisherman's operation and tells him he could help turn it into a multi-million-dollar company with a brand that would be known across the world. You can start by hiring a fleet of fishermen, he says. Open a factory to can the fish, find distributors, partner up with a trucking company, start talking to national grocery stores, and in 10, 15 years tops, you'll be able to sell the company and retire as a rich man. The fisherman asks, "And what will I do then?" The businessman replies, "Oh, I don't know. You could spend your mornings fishing. You could nap in the afternoons, and at night you could drink beers and play cards with your friends." But as enlightening as parables can be, the standardized clock serves a purpose, many purposes. And for most of us, so does working to build something greater than yourself. With the clock and its late predecessor, the Google Calendar, we can make accurate plans with others, coordinate travel on a massive scale, and pay people more fairly than simply eyeballing their effort. And yet, we seem to be shifting towards wanting to live in the timeless time once again. Books on the flow state are so common that you probably understand what I mean by flow state without me explaining it. And if you don't, you can look up the author Stephen Kotler. Kotler is spelled Kotler. Maybe it's just my inner bubble of, wanting to be a writer and do all this creative work. But I think that as humanity evolves, I think the tendency is to want to do more non-linear creative work. Work that involves problem solving, critical thinking, rather than merely putting things in an assembly line. And when I say nonlinear, I mean we want to do work where 1 minute of time does not equal 1 minute of pay. I think, again, I know I'm projecting, maybe it's just only me, so I'll speak only for myself, but I want to be judged based on the outcome of my work, rather than the effort I put in. Because when we're judged for the outcome, the potential upside, the potential return on investment can be exponential. And I apologize if that's a little bit confusing, but just think that, let's say you're a filmmaker and you made a feature film. It took you, this obviously would not be true, but let's say it took you 100 hours. Instead of getting paid for 100 hours, what if you were paid for all the ticket sales you produced? Which has the potential to be much, much, much greater than your dollars per hour rate of 100 hours. Consider your own thoughts on what that means to you. I mean, is that something that you consider for yourself? Are you content if you are working something that is paying hourly? Is that what you want? Or do you want something that is outcome-based? Obviously, it's going to depend on a career-by-career basis, but just consider for yourself if that's relevant to you. Now, the final thing I'll say about the evolution of clock time, of scheduling things, is that there is an extreme. If we go back in history, we can see how it has failed. There's a really interesting, I wouldn't call it an experiment, just a piece of history that I won't go too deep into. I think it's worth reading, but when Stalin was in power, when the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union, they attempted to enforce a really, really strict schedule on all its citizens for productivity's sake. And it completely backfired. Essentially, the whole population was split into 5 categories, and that category represented what day you took off work. And your loved ones would probably not be in the same group as you. Your children may not be in the same group as you. And if that were the case, then, if you didn't have your friends in that group, your 1 day off of 4 extremely hard days of labor would just be spent with no one. Of course, that is the getting the maximum productivity out of everyone mindset, but it clearly doesn't work. There's clearly a need for community. But again, worth reading that on your own. I want to move into part 2, at least how I'm categorizing it. And that part 2 is productivity existentialism. I bought a book with time management in the title. Why? I mean, I already kind of went into why I was drawn to this cover, but, I didn't miss the fact that this is a time management book. Clearly, there's something, in my own head that inspired me to buy something that I thought might, maybe productive isn't the right word, but I was looking for some advice, some idea, some technique that would lessen the burden of overwhelm, of the time problem I mentioned just a little bit ago, the having too much to do in too little time. Now, I didn't want to learn another spin on the Pomodoro technique based on some study that they did with 10 participants. I just wanted someone with some modest success to tell me that I'm wearing out the soles of my shoes on a fucking hamster wheel. I wanted someone to say exactly what this book described as the limit embracing life, which I'll discuss in just a moment. Even though I conceptually knew the concepts of memento mori, remember death, and the insignificance of the human lifespan and the unfolding of the cosmos, but I needed someone to say it blatantly, without remorse or but hey, here's the upside in all this. Now, of course, because this is a self-help book, there is a little bit of, hey, but here's the upside in all this. And the upside in accepting the reality of our insignificance is encapsulated well by a quote in the book that the author mentions from the Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck. And it goes, "The human disease is often painful, but it's only unbearable for as long as you're under the impression that there might be a cure." That is really as Zen as it gets. Stop holding your breath. You're going to pass out. Let go, I think, is the ultimate message of that quote. If you're always holding out hope that, there is some magic solution, that there is greener grass on the other side, then you're always going to be a little bit more miserable than the human condition actually is. You're always going to be a little bit more cynical about the present because you're holding out hope for this utopian future. And I think the utopian future is a good segue into what I want to talk about next, which the author presents this idea, and I loved it, and I just took it and wanted to run with it. And it's that convenience ruins inconvenient things. Silicon Valley's culture of ultra-convenience and exceptional user design is a trap. Or maybe a trap isn't the right word, but we're all suffering in the long run. It was a trend that was really brought about by Steve Jobs, and I don't think he foresaw what this would do to the culture at large. Because now, instead of a life that is mildly kind of medium inconvenient, for the most part, with moments of convenience, which we may call luck or serendipity, it's flipped because of the technology in our pocket. When ultra convenience becomes the standard in software, and there's literally whole teams and millions of dollars being spent on the most minute but convenient details of an app, suddenly minor inconveniences piss us off. In the real world, waiting in line somehow becomes unbearable when we have DoorDash and Grubhub at our fingertips. Suddenly, a trip to the grocery store seems unnecessary when someone else can pick out the ripe avocado for us. And real-world conveniences and that thing I just mentioned called luck begins to slip by unnoticed. It's like being surrounded in a field of four-leaf clovers. Suddenly, it ceases to be a symbol of luck. Luck is rare and scarce by definition, and to create an online world where luck, and by that I'm saying it's when the right thing finds you and not the other way around, when luck is built into the design, we make ourselves fragile to non-luck. Not bad luck, but merely things not going as planned. Non-luck you can think of as inconvenience. Now, the argument could be made that really in the long run it's better to have mostly good luck and convenience with only moments of bad luck and inconvenience. But I have to wonder, what is the unintended consequence of going against the natural order of things? Because nature is not convenient. There is no user design in the real world. Well, that's not true, but natural things don't have the human experience in mind. What might be the consequence of living in a world of ultra convenience and comfort that our psychology, our physiology, our biology was not designed to evolve for? Well, I figured I'd come up with a little bit of a list, which didn't take me too long to think up. First of all, we're less appreciative of little moments, and I'm excluding that forcing quality of gratitude journals. We're more selfish and individualistic. We're less resilient to stress, more susceptible to anxiety and depression, which in this case I'm correlating with a lack of stress resilience. We're less patient, less capable of delayed gratification, more likely to be caught in a rut, less strong-willed, as in we're less willing to stand up for our beliefs. We're more overwhelmed by small stressors, less likely to work on difficult goals, and more likely to aim for an unattainable state of perfection. And that's just to name a few. And if you were listening closely, you might have heard a paradox. It seems strange that ultra-convenience will simultaneously make it less likely for us to work on difficult goals and more likely to aim for a state of perfection. And the way I'm speaking about perfection here, because, in my head, perfection means that I've achieved my difficult goals, but I think this new form of perfection is depicted as living the easy and adventurous life. And that takes the form of all those travel pictures and videos you see of people doing yoga on top of a mountain and looking so relaxed and refreshed and at peace with the world on name whatever social media you want. Now, clearly, it makes no sense for, some, I don't even know who would go about doing this, the government to say, make these apps less convenient, make it harder to use. But theoretically, if we flip this Silicon Valley credo of convenience at all costs, and I'll just say, from an individual point of view, you yourself can make addictive things like technology more inconvenient for yourself. There's plenty of ways to do that. But if it was done on a massive scale, those unintended consequences I just pointed out would be flipped. We would be more resilient to stress, more likely to stand up for what we believe in, and not just be one of the echoes on social media. But I think the true ramification of an inconvenient life is that it forces us to slow down. A metaphor for this would be running on a treadmill versus running on a treadmill in a waist-high pool. With the former, more convenient example, there's always the pressure to increase the speed, to up the ante until we trip and hurt ourselves. But with the latter, there's an inherent block on our acceleration. Every movement becomes more intentional. Plus, the added benefit is that you will become much stronger in the long run. Now, to really hammer home this point, that making life a little bit more inconvenient for yourself is worth it in the long run and even in the short run because of all those basically unintended consequences flipping in your favor, is that it's not hard. This is not David Goggins level, wake up at 4 a.m., run a marathon before breakfast type of inconvenience. Exposing yourself to small inconveniences can be as simple as not doing certain things, not bringing your headphones to a place you know you need to wait in line. I really got away from what Burkeman was talking about when he mentioned Silicon Valley's, convenience at all costs. He kind of had a different take on it. He says, convenience makes things easy, without regard to whether easiness is truly what's most valuable in any given context. Take those services, on which I've relied too much in recent years, that let you design and then remotely mail a birthday card, so you never see or touch the physical item yourself. Better than nothing, perhaps. But sender and recipient both know it's a poor substitute for purchasing a card in a shop, writing on it by hand, and then walking to a mailbox to mail it. Because contrary to the cliche, it really isn't the thought that counts, but the effort, which is to say, the inconvenience. Burkeman looks at it from the perspective of how too much convenience destroys communities and distances relationships. When I think of how convenience might destroy relationships or communities, I think of texting. I think as a means of making plans to see a person in real life, that's great. It's a great tool. But for connecting two human beings, I don't think anything is more hollow. The messages are kept brief. Sincere messages don't have much emotional resonance. And all the hundreds of micro details and facial expression, vocal tone, body posture can't be expressed. Except, well, now we've got emojis and special means of punctuating. But those are all primed to be misinterpreted. And if you've ever typed LOL with a serious face, then you know that this form of communication doesn't allow for true expression. Now, to finish off this section, there are 3 phrases which really, really stood out to me in the book. And I don't know if the author came up with all of them himself, but I'll mention them and riff on them for a few moments. The first is existential overwhelm. When everything around you has so much meaning that there really is no meaning. And the author has a great little blurb about really explaining this, how it relates to technology. He says, Facebook, for example, is an extremely efficient way to stay informed about events you might like to attend. But it's also a guaranteed way to hear about more events you'd like to attend than anyone possibly could attend. OkCupid is an efficient way to find people to date, but also being constantly reminded about all the other potentially more alluring people you might be dating instead. Email is an unparalleled tool for responding rapidly to a large volume of messages. But then again, if it weren't for email, you wouldn't be receiving all those messages in the first place. The second phrase is secular modernity, in which the only philosophy the average person may follow today is whatever is applicable and practical now. And that again goes back to what I mentioned before of needing to disguise this as a self-help book, of needing to sprinkle in practicality to make it more readable. The third phrase, which I think is the most interesting, is this idea of assumptions of competence, which, I mean, if you remember being a kid, I think every profession, including being a parent, we had these assumptions of competence. The author says that he originally thought journalists had that. Everyone in a newsroom is a fantastic writer. They love this stuff. And then he says he joined a newspaper and that all kind of went out the window. He could see the chaos of it. And then I think it's funny, he says he transferred that assumption of competence to people in government. I think for myself, I had this for films. And I think most artists of any medium have this trick is revealed and the magic is lost moment. In the exact same way that a magician learning a new trick might, of course they lose a little bit of the magic or sense of wonderment, but they get to create that sense of wonder for someone else. All my friends who were also filmmakers, I'm sure would relate to this, but, watching a movie now, I can see when they're dubbing the audio. I know the little tricks they do. Even if, even a Hollywood film, of course they're doing it with a massive budget, but knowing that, whatever sound effect is used, it's probably not the actual sound effect that you're seeing on screen. To sum it up, in the words of the esteemed rapper Action Bronson, I got older and I realized there was no heroes. Maybe a little bit sad, but very true. Part 3, secular and esoteric solutions. I think Burkeman, the author, has this incredible skill of turning very spiritual and esoteric ideas into something practical and secular. I don't think that's a good thing or a bad thing. But at this point in time, that's the language that most modern folk speak. If an important idea doesn't have a footnote that expresses exactly how to use that idea in 60 seconds or less, then you suddenly lose the bulk of your audience who needs a book about accepting their own mortality, of letting go of their productivity delusions. And the major solution, I don't know if that's the perfect word, that the author offers up is embrace finitude. There's a German term, Eigenheit, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but what it means is let things take the time it takes, proper time, I think is what I saw on some website, the time inherent to a process itself. And that was the thing I mentioned way at the beginning of this. The person in the Middle Ages who would think it's absurd to say, milk the cow in an hour or less. They would say, I'll milk the cow until it no longer needs to be milked. And I think in this case, in the grand scheme, the modern scheme of this word, really Burkeman boils it down to you have to decide. You have to let go of certain things. You can't simultaneously want to be a neurosurgeon and an engineer and a filmmaker and a musician. You got to pick one or two. You have to embrace your finitude. accept the limit-embracing life. Only in finitude are we able to live fully. Here's a little parable to nail this point. Imagine you have a bowl full of water. Can you fill it anymore? One person may say, of course not, it's full. But then a second person who's trying to live life to the fullest may say, yeah, sure, splash it on. That's usually the productivity junkie who says, there's probably a millimeter left in that bowl I could probably squeeze. And then when that water begins to spill over the edge, which it inevitably will, they feel like they're losing something, like they're failing, like they couldn't do what they thought they could. But then there's a third person, the one who accepts their finitude, who happily dumps their bowl of water and holds it out fresh for a new filling. Now, just as you can't hold your breath forever, you can't hold on to your life situation forever. There's constantly going to be the need to dump your bowl of water to get fresh water. Now, one little thing that I'll mention, kind of a tidbit of philosophy, which I thought was so interesting, is that this one philosopher, Martin Heidegger, who this was very clearly, explicitly stated that he was a card-carrying Nazi, so you need to either separate the philosophy from the philosopher or just, I guess, ignore this part. But the philosophical argument that he made is that we are time, that consciousness is time. So instead of saying or thinking that we have a limited amount of time, Heidegger would say we are a limited amount of time, that we are not separate from the movement of time. I'm saying time too much. And I think the subtle effect in this shift in thinking is that being in the now becomes sticky. The second we begin to project our thoughts into the future or the past, then that secondary thought that we are time snaps us into thinking that even thoughts of the future or past are inescapably part of the now. It's like trying to get unstuck from wet cement when you are cement yourself. But should we be scared of that? Pessimistic? That we can't save time like we thought that we deluded ourselves that we could? Really, I think the emotions, and I think the author mentions this as well, but those emotions of being scared, of being pessimistic, of being cynical, come from the frame of still believing that there could be that saving for the future, saving time, and being able to get it all done. It's that holding out hope of an absurdly delusional idea. And when you let go of that, of thinking that, there is going to be this perfect amount of time, that there really are going to be 4,000 weeks, because really it's unpredictable. When you let go of all those future imaginings, well, there is no need to be scared or pessimistic. There is no thought about being fearful of any of that stuff, because we're right here. We're sticking to the now. But really, one of the most interesting ideas, and I think this is more of a general summing up of a few different passages from the book, but one of the things that I really got from this is the connection between religious salvation, Buddhist Nirvana / Satori, and secular productivity perfection. I really don't have a dog in the fight of, if you're religious, you're wrong, or if you're atheist, you're wrong. But I just think it's kind of funny that as secularization reaches this crescendo in the Western world, it's the nose-up atheists who are always quick to point out the absurdity in heaven and hell while missing their own variation of it. The idealized self, the one who finishes each day feeling fulfilled and boundlessly productive, is just the second version of a second coming of Christ. Even if this idealized self is never expressly sought out, its subconscious implication takes the form of feeling like you missed out on something today, or you didn't do all that you could, or whatever. It's a constant, or at least cyclical, feeling of inferiority compared to someone that doesn't exist, someone we've created in our mind, and our imagination can always top our reality. I just think the author does a really good job at reaching that latter group of people, the ultra-secular, the ultra-atheists, with anecdotes that are mostly stripped of their religious origins, but really, it all comes down to the cyclical nature of time. By concluding thoughts, I want to come back to the original proposition I made at the beginning of this episode that this book is philosophy disguised as self-help, to make it more accessible and popular. Because I think this will be a recurring theme in future books that I feature on this podcast. I think self-help is the language of pop culture, at least the positive side of pop culture, because there's always going to be the celebrity gossip, the true crime, the kind of disturbing news. That would be more of the negative side of pop culture. But if we're on the positive side, our focus inevitably turns to practical advice. Tidbits of usefulness that can be applied in 60 seconds or less. And almost all of it is recycled from someone else's blog or reworded from someone else's podcast. So it's all an echo chamber of stupid fucking advice that you'll try once before moving on to the next thing. This is inherently opposite of the book's central message, to be self-help. But the way I see it, the author, Oliver Burkeman, needed to use the trick of practicality to deliver the important stuff to the people who wouldn't have otherwise found the book. And maybe I'm one of those people. I probably would not have picked up a book that was purely just modern philosophy. The fact that there was just that hint of self-help was the thing that probably pushed me over the edge and added it to my cart. I also could be reading into things too much, especially considering that the author's background is as one of those bloggers who wrote I tried the Pomodoro productivity technique and here are 5 things that happened types of stories. So maybe the practicality aspect was automatic to him. But what this book shows is that the writers and thinkers who think they're too good for cutesy listicles can strike a balance between the SEO clickability that is so central to modern internet culture and also deep thought inspired by ancient philosophers and profound realizations. To finish off, Burkeman offers 5 questions at the end of the book to reflect on. I won't spoil the first 4, but the final one really stuck with me. And it's this. How would you spend your days differently if you didn't care so much about seeing your actions reach fruition? At this point in history, with social media making everyone a micro-celebrity, or at least giving the illusion of it, we in the US are more outcome-oriented than ever. We judge our efforts by likes and comments and retweets and followers and all those other forms of digital currency that can't really be redeemed for anything of real value. It's like those McDonald's Monopoly sweepstakes. There's always the illusion of a big win right around the corner, but in the meantime, everyone wastes time and money and destroys their health in the process. To answer the question implies that we ask another before answering it. What would you need to understand and believe in order to forego the carrot that's always dangling 3 inches in front of our face? Only when we see the absurdity of playing a popularity game, a status game, with a billion other people, can we ask and answer the question of how we'll spend our time irrelevant of the outcome. Let me say that again. Only when we see the absurdity of playing the digital popularity game, when we see that as absurd, then we can really ask and answer that question of how we'll spend our time irrelevant of a popularity-based outcome. I hope you think deeply on that question. I hope you buy this book and find new takeaways and tell people and spread the message that, yes, productivity is a hard-to-escape trap, but a trap nonetheless, and one worth removing yourself from. The book is 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman, and there will be a little affiliate link in the description, which will just help support the show. I'll get a little money, but at no extra charge to you. My name is Sean Green, and I thank you for taking the time to think on this book with me. Please leave a review if you enjoyed the episode and subscribe if you want to hear more stuff like this. Thanks.